Hello, this is Claude Sports Corner, and I'm going to talk about the greatest defense of all time in the NFL. Now, most of the times, there are only mainly a couple of teams that come up. I mean, there's about five, but for the most part, it boils down to two teams. It boils down to the 70s Pittsburgh Steelers. I don't want to say the Steel Curtain because the Steel Curtain was not the entire Pittsburgh Steelers defense. The Steel Curtain was the front four of the 70s, the early 70s, early to mid 70s Pittsburgh Steelers. That was the Steel Curtain. It was Dwight White, Ernie Holmes, L.C. Greenwood, and of course, the great Mean Joe Green. That's the Steel Curtain. The defense later on became known as the Steel Curtain defense, but real Steeler fans know that the Steel Curtain were those four guys, and those four guys only. But for the sake of this argument, we'll say the Steel Curtain defense of the mid to late 70s, taking on the Chicago Bears, and not just the 85 Bears, because the Bears were actually a very stingy defense from 1984 to, I'll say, about 1988. So I'll give them that. Now, I understand they only won one Super Bowl, but the 86 defense was actually statistically better than the 85 defense. In fact, the 84 Bears defense actually had more sacks than the 85 Chicago Bear defense. So a lot of people like to say that the Bears were a one-hit wonder when it came to their defense. There's nothing further from the truth than that. And I'm a Steeler fan, but as you know, I am honest and I'm fair, and I give respect where it's due. And the Chicago Bears defense definitely deserves and demands that respect. That being said, in my opinion, there's no better defense. No one did it for a longer period of time. And when you look at the amount of Hall of Famers on that defense compared to the Bears defense, there might be four Bears that could have played on the Steelers' Hall of Fame defense. And I'm stretching for that, okay? And in fact, you know what? Let's break it down by each unit. The defensive line, linebackers, and the secondary. Let's break it down that way. And I'm also going to bring in other factors. Let's start with the defensive line. To me, Steelers get that edge easy. Mean Joe Green is twice the player that Dan Hampton was. The fridge isn't even in the discussion. If you want to say Richard Dent was a better defensive end than L.C. Greenwood, you know what? I'm not going to argue that because Richard Dent was a great pass rusher. No question about it. Now, I believe L.C. Greenwood was the better all-around player, but Richard Dent was an absolute force in rushing the quarterback. Steve McMichael versus Ernie Holmes, or if you want to say Fridge Perry, no way. Couldn't touch Ernie Holmes, no way in God's green earth. Just no way. Dwight White was a better player than the opposite defensive end for the Chicago Bears. It's not even close. I have to give that easy to the Pittsburgh Steelers. I have to give them a 3-1 edge if you're going front four. Remember, the Steelers at that time played a 4-3. The Steelers, ever since Mean Joe Green retired, have been a 3-4 defense. Now let's look at the linebackers. I'm going to say even when it comes to Lambert and Singletary. If you want to give a slight edge to Singletary, that's fine. You cannot say that Otis Wilson is anywhere in the stratosphere of Jack Ham. Jack Ham, outside of Lawrence Taylor, who's in a class by himself, The best outside linebacker to ever have played in professional football is Jack Ham. Period, point blank. Wilber Marshall against either Andy Russell or Lauren Taves, I have to give it to Wilber. Wilber Marshall was a great player. In fact, Wilber Marshall might be the most unsung player in the entire debate when you look at both teams. I would have said Donnie Shell, but Donnie Shell just got into the Hall of Fame. He will be inducted later on this year. That's why I have to say that Wilber Marshall, who I don't know if he will make the Hall of Fame, and in fact, I could make a case that Wilber Marshall's best days were with the Washington Redskins when they won their third and final Super Bowl. But Wilber Marshall was a unique and great football player, great linebacker in his own right. Now, he's not as good as Lambert. He's not as good as Singletary. He certainly isn't as good as Jack Ham, but he's better than Lauren Taves and Otis Wilson. Now let's look at that secondary. This is where the Steelers just blow the Chicago Bears out of the water. And I'm not just talking about the fact that Dan Marino torched them. Listen, Dan Marino would have torched anybody. I mean, he was at the apex. I mean, that's like Michael Jordan in the late 80s and early 90s. That's how great Marino was at the quarterback position. When you look at the Steelers secondary, when you look at Mel Blount, Donnie Shell, Ron Johnson later on, Glenn Edwards later on, well, actually, during the mid-'70s, J.T. Thomas, you look at those guys. Outside of Gary Fensick, and he couldn't play on those Steeler teams, trust me. There's not one guy in the secondary that could have played with the Steelers in the 70s that could even compare. The only guy that could even back up anybody would be maybe Gary Fensick. Doug Plank, no. Leslie Frazier, no. And he was a decent cover corner. Dave Durson, nah. If you want to put Dave Durson over Mike Wagner, I mean, I'll give you that because Dave Durson was a better hitter. But Donnie Shell, remember, Dave Durson, I believe, played, no, it was Gary Fensick who played strong safety. Dave Durson was the free... No, Dave Durson was the strong safety. I apologize. So I'll give Fensick that. I think he was better than Mike Wagner. Dave Durson, nowhere near Donnie Shell. Not even close. The Steeler corners, much better. Not even close. Edge, Steelers. In fact, the Steelers win on all three phases. And the killer is when you look at the competition. When the 85 Bears won the Super Bowl, they beat quarterbacks like Dieter Brock. I mean, Phil Simms was a decent quarterback. Tony Eason, Steve Grogan. I mean, those were garbage quarterbacks. Look at who the Steelers had to beat in order to win Super Bowls. They had to go through Bob Greasy, Hall of Famer. Fran Tarkenton, Hall of Famer. Roger Staubach, Hall of Famer. Kenny Stabler, Hall of Famer. Those are the guys they had to go through. Earl Campbell, Hall of Famer, running back. I understand that. The only clunker, if you want to say Dan Pastorini, fine. Vince Ferragamo, obviously the last Super Bowl. But it's not even close. The Steelers win convincingly. And they are, in my opinion, the greatest defense of all time in NFL history. Please like, share, and subscribe, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Claude White. Take care, and God bless.